With everything that's happening in America today and around the world, many people have asked, is America even worth saving?
You are listening to Wealth Talks with the McPhees. You know, Zig Ziglar used to say that the healthiest of human emotions is gratitude, and the most destructive is revenge. He went on to say that the more you express gratitude for what you have, the more likely you will have even more to express gratitude for.
You know, I think as we look at America today, I'm reminded of the dragon in Revelation that is waiting, just crouching to take and destroy the child that the woman is about ready to give birth to. And America is an experiment that's never been tried before anywhere else in the world. It's the longest lasting constitution in the world. It's lasted, multiple times longer than any other constitution. We're well past 200 years now. Many constitutions never even get past the second decade.
Yeah, I think the average is about 17 years.
And so this is an experiment that God allowed to happen. He blessed it because of the founding fathers who weren't perfect, but realized in their own imperfections what they needed to do to keep a government from becoming tyrannical and destroying the lives of individual liberty like they had experienced in the old world.
Mm-hmm. And last week we talked about how the biblical blueprint for finances applies in many areas of our life. And if we go back and look at the nation that features most prominently in the biblical history, that would be the nation of Israel. It was founded on a promise. America is has an interesting relationship to that because America is the only nation, to my knowledge, besides Israel, that was founded based on a promise, looking forward to the future of religious freedoms as the Pilgrims left the religious persecution in Europe and came to a new world to start a better life and to found a different country that was based on a promise, based on biblical values.
You're absolutely right. And unlike Daniel in the Old Testament, we've got people today that want to go back and pick apart all of our founding fathers and find all of their fallacies and sins and say, we can't listen to those people because they were horrible people. And we just need to annihilate that and start over. And what Daniel did is he prayed to God and he said, please forgive the sins of my forefathers and my sin so that you can bless us in the future. And that's what we have to kind of do today in America. Nobody's perfect. And if we're going to judge our founding fathers for their sins, what is the future generation going to look back and say to us? Jesus, said, he who is without sin can cast the first stone. And each of us have just as glaring sins and fallacies and errors in our life as our founding fathers did, and maybe worse.
Yeah.
We don't know. We're not the judge. We can't see that. But we have to realize that America can still be blessed by God if we ask for the forgiveness of those sins that were committed, the sins that we've committed, and realize that God does not hold the children accountable for the sins of their fathers or forefathers. That's told to us in Ezekiel 8:20, as well as in Romans chapter 6, verse 23. So if we're going to judge people worse and more severely than God does, then that judgment we pass on others is going to be passed on to us as well.
That's an interesting thought because so many people, they see the sins of the past and they see the imperfections of the present, and they think that starting over will be somehow starting a new slate, from a clean slate. Getting the retribution and all of that off the table, but starting over from what? Because you're starting over from imperfection again, and all of the attempts to start over in history or to purge the evil have always resulted in worse atrocities.
It has. And what I like about reading the Bible is that God doesn't hide anything from us. When he tells us the story about Abraham, he tells us that Abraham was a liar. He lied about his wife to a couple of men, and they took his wife and treated her like that she was their own wife. And and then God takes him, and Sarah encourages him to take another woman to have a child with, and then Sarah hates that woman because she had a child. Okay? So, but these people were still used by God, and that's what we have to realize, that we can be used by God today to save America, just like our forefathers who were sinners just like us, because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. They were used by God to start an experiment of freedom, liberty, and justice for all. And it has been established and lasted so long because it was built on the principles that God set down.
Yeah, built on a solid foundation.
Even though it was sinful people that brought that document together that united us.
And there were certain compromises that were made when that was being founded. Those have been corrected, some of them by constitutional amendments over the years. But if you look back at the beliefs of many of those founding fathers, they were trying to do what was right despite their sins.
Well, Abraham certainly compromised on God's promise by taking a second wife to have a child with, to try to fulfill God's promise. So that always happens with human nature, because human nature is sinful. It's fallen. But that doesn't mean that we throw out the baby with the bathwater. And we've got to take the good from that and move forward and make sure that that happens. Because, America's values, what our founding fathers wrote, even in their disagreements, they weeded out a lot of things that could have been in that Constitution. They took some things out that should have been in it, like a definite mention of anti-slavery should have been in that Constitution, and it was,
and
except
it was
for
in
two.
Jefferson's draft.
Yes, except for two of the original 13 states didn't want it in there, and so in order to unify them, they had to take that out. But the thing is we are very blessed in this country, and anyone that has traveled around the world, even for brief moments, knows that America still is the greatest country. And I like to talk to people that have traveled extensively, and they talk about the lines that are waiting at the U.S. embassies in those countries that are waiting to apply to get into this country legally. Or just look at the millions of illegal immigration that has happened this year. People want to come to America because it is something different than any other place in the world.
Yeah. And not everyone who wants to come here fully understands why it is different, but they do understand the benefits of it, and they want to be a part of that because they don't have such those opportunities in their country. Why do they have those opportunities? The root of it goes back to the founding principles that our country was built upon.
Yes. A lot of times people want to complain about the slavery that took place in America, and rightfully so. It should have never happened. But we also have to look back in the Bible and look at a slave owner that was called a dear brother of Paul, the apostle, Philemon.
Yeah.
And even in that letter, Paul was sending a slave back to him and said, I hope you do the right thing by him, but I'm not going to command you, even though I have the right to do it. Because when
he wanted him to do it as his own free will.
That's what God wants. He wants us to do the right thing because it's the right thing, not because there's a law saying you got to do this or else. And that's the freedom that we have in America, to do the right thing, to worship God in our own way. And a big part of that is the commerce that takes place between people.
Oh, it's a huge part, because if there's not commerce, it's a well-known fact that if there's not commerce crossing borders, then it's just a matter of time until armies will.
It is. That's exactly right. Look at all the wars that have been fought in history over the acquisition of salt, because salt used to be the only way to preserve any food long enough that it didn't spoil. And so, especially meat products. And so there were actual wars fought over salt. We look at when you can't trade between groups of people, then you begin to think of that people as your enemy. If they don't value the things that we value, then that commerce is restricted. But if we can open those values up and share values, then commerce can flow more quickly.
Fascinating. So that kind of refers to, people say that free commerce is one of the things that America is built on. And so, there's free commerce between the states. It's unrestricted between the states. The federal government makes sure that flow is supposed to happen. They also use it to overreach a little bit into definitions of interstate commerce.
They've definitely overabused that, but that free commerce, that commerce clause in the Constitution, was to keep one state from taxing the imports of another state, making it where there was not free trade happening. They wanted to unify the country, and when you have barriers of free trade, then that causes a resistance, and there could be multiple civil wars within the United States where Texas fights Oklahoma because they don't want Oklahoma oil coming into Texas, and Oklahoma fights Texas because they don't want, what Texas has to offer Oklahoma.
So a free trade is good.
It is.
In that respect. So some people would then take and extend that to free trade with other nations, that we should trade with them regardless of the values if they can simply get us a better price. That is very much typified in American corporate world today, where a lot of production and industry happens overseas, even in countries that we don't share their values, even countries that use slave labor simply because they can get a better price.
And here's the problem with that, is they're not united under the Constitution that the United States is. And they have there's a different value system, and so we can't go in and freely trade with those people. In fact, the Founding Fathers raised revenue in this state by taxing those other countries.
Yeah, they use tariffs.
They import tax. And so, and that was a better way of supporting our federal government because it kept it more limited. And then it was the Marxist ideology that came in, that Woodrow Wilson signed the income tax, which is the first tenet of communism, that you have to have a graduated income tax. And so, our Constitution has been compromised in the interstate commerce clause as well as the tax laws and whatnot, and particularly in giving over to the Federal Reserve Bank the right to conduct monetary policy. Because what they have done is they have diluted the value of our commerce so much by making so much money that the value now is not as definitive and defined as it used to be.
Well, it's fascinating. We're getting a little bit closer. You can see here as we're talking about history in America, we're getting a little bit closer to the financial aspect, which is what we often talk about on this podcast. First, we went to some of the foundational elements, and then we went to commerce, and now we're getting to the Federal Reserve System, which controls a lot of our currency today. And interestingly, America has always had some interesting relationships with money. It goes all the way back. People like Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton were bitter rivals on the number of issues, but also on the issue of a central banking system. Alexander Hamilton believed that the country needed a central banking system, and Aaron Burr and the Thomas Jefferson camp were more against that type of thing.
That's right.
So none of that actually ever made it into the Constitution. And you have an interesting history with a couple of different national banks that happened in the United States and then were abolished before the Federal Reserve System came along in 1913. It's always been a plague with the business cycle and everything.
In fact, here's another example of one of those early fathers who probably has more evil about him than good, and that is Andrew Jackson. I mean, he hated black patriots. He hated black people. He is the one that instigated the removal of Native Americans off of their lands in Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, and forced them to move to Oklahoma, the Trail of Tears, where over 1/5 of the population of those people died. And he was a very evil, violent man, and didn't treat his own slaves with any respect at all. And is written, but yet he still understood that commerce was what kept us together as a country, and he killed one of the first national banks.
Yes.
So
he really
even God used him, even in his vile wickedness, to do something that was good for the unity of the United States.
Yeah, and he was also a very prominent general in the War of 1812, and probably saved a lot of the expansion of the United States westward, because if the British would have taken New Orleans, then they would have controlled the mouth of the Mississippi River, which is where all the commerce of the expanding West was brought to market.
So it's not our job to judge someone whether they are in heaven or hell, or whether they were good or bad. We just have to look at people as people. They did some good things, they did some bad things, and some of them, there's a lot more bad things that are recorded about them, but we can't then say, well, they never did any good, because history shows us that there were some very good things that even really bad people did.
Fascinating. Fascinating. And so this definitely affects our finances today. The financial legacy, commerce
Yes.
that has brought down. And yet this is an ongoing effort. In order to maintain our financial freedom and independence, we have to manage our finances wisely in the current environment, which means working under the Federal Reserve banking system and all of that. So how do we do that in today's environment?
Well, Nelson Nash, the founder of Becoming Your Own Banker, realized that the Federal Reserve, which was authorized under President Woodrow Wilson, who perhaps besides Andrew Jackson, was one of the most evil people that ever was president in our country, because of the way he reinstituted the negative and evil KKK. He also rewrote history and took all black patriots out of it.
Yeah.
He instituted the Federal Reserve. He made senators appointed by states instead of elected by the populace instead of by
pass
states.
That amendment.
So it nullified a lot of the states' rights that kept the United States more unified, and then he also instituted the Marxist idea of a graduated income tax. So, but because of that, we have to have a tool that we can still operate a little bit independently of these regulatory things that have happened. And Nelson Nash realized that participating whole life, because it pre-existed Woodrow Wilson's income tax, that it pre-existed Woodrow Wilson's Federal Reserve Bank, still had some principles of free commerce in it.
So it was grandfathered in.
It was grandfathered in. And so now we can have money that is represented by owning paid-up life insurance, and that paid-up and life insurance can be leveraged. It's controlled by the states rather than the federal government, so it gives us a little bit more of the states' rights that we need, a little independent from the central government. And that money, when we leverage it, can still grow while we use that money someplace else to finance our lifestyle.
Fascinating. And so we're still part of the system, whereas if the Federal Reserve decides to create more money, then that makes all U.S. dollars everywhere less valuable. And yet this gives us a tool to fight back against it, because we don't have to lock our money away in some investment or something like that, but we still have the opportunity to use it along the way, which is how you fight inflation, is you
have to keep it flowing,
keep it
moving, because a currency that isn't flowing is not a currency anymore, and money is the currency that directs our commerce. And if it's not flowing, then we're not participating in commerce. And if it's just flowing away from us, then we are actually making ourselves
we're bleeding.
We're bleeding. We're becoming poorer and poorer because we're not having any control of that coming back to us. So yes.
So when we look at commerce today, having commerce with people with shared values, taxes, inflation, even government regulations, both from the legislative branch and the executive branch, the regulations that come from both of those sectors today, they put limits on that. And this is a way that we can bypass some of those limits and get back to some of the historical financial agreements that helped people to band together mutually to manage their finances and manage other areas of their life. And I think a key component of this is, do you look to government for your needs, or do you look to God for your needs ultimately? Regardless of the system that we're working in, those two constants hold true throughout history. When a people looks to government for their sustenance, then the tyrants arise.
They do.
Versus when they look to God for their sustenance, then tyrants occasionally rise, but then they're put down and the nation continues.
Again, that makes me go back to what Nelson Nash always used to say in the seminars that he taught, and that is, all men's problems arise when they look to the little g, government, instead of the big G, God, for the solution. And when he used to say that if you take away the Social Security check of most senior citizens, we'll find out who their God is really quick.
That's a point, because the Social Security system is really not owed to people. It's an entitlement program. The Supreme Court ruled out. It used to be called an insurance program. Those days have long gone.
They're long gone, and not that we should avoid paying the Social Security tax, because we don't want anyone to go to prison. But the fact is we can't depend on that to be there for us, because in the early 1960s, the Supreme Court ruled there is no obligation for the government to pay you what you think is due.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we start depending on the government for that entitlement, we've got a problem, and we need to become more self-reliant on God rather than self-reliant on the government.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Doesn't mean that we can't be good stewards because I don't think there's much you can do to opt out of Social Security. It's kind of a requirement. So if you get, you're receiving the check, use it wisely. Use it as part of the money that God has given you, but don't rely on it, I guess would be the message.
And we need to manage our affairs so that we get the most of it back, because that isn't our money that we paid, that's God's money. Mm-hmm. And, Jesus said, we're only to render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and we're render to God what belongs to God. And to prove his point, he took a koan, and the one that had Caesar replicated, and he was implying that everything belongs to God.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only because he gave Caesar the power to collect that is that tax should be owed.
Mm-hmm. I want to address kind of an elephant in the room here when we're talking about God's blueprint for managing money, for managing life, even as far as it comes down to government, like we've been talking about today. A lot of people look at organized religion. They say, I don't really want any part of that, and because there's a lot of hypocrites in organized religion, and organized religion itself has been a tyranny over the years. So what's the difference between the type of organized religion that you see stereotyped as religion today versus the type of faith that we're talking about right here today?
Well, I think if you study the Bible and the scriptures about money, and then you go into any church across America, and you listen to what they teach about money, you'll find some contradictions. And this isn't the time or the place to talk about those, but the scripture tells us that God loves a cheerful giver. So when people are giving because they're trying to appease God in some way, or to follow some protocol or law that their church or their pastor set down, there's a problem there to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
Because, if they're just doing it to do that, and they're not doing it cheerfully but doing it out of a legality, God can't bless that. The other thing is a lot of people give in an environment so that they are recognized by their peers. And Jesus warns very carefully that they have their reward in full right now, and there will be no reward for them later. Mm-hmm. So, again, this is kind of like looking at our forefathers and judging them. We can see those errors in churches today and synagogues and around the country where people of faith meet and worship.
And in history.
In history. Is it our job to criticize and judge those people? It's our job to discern what they're doing and not become part of it. Because we have some glaring issues ourselves that are just as bad. But we should look at what those institutions are doing that is good, and let's focus on that and pull together in the ecclesia that the Greeks understood, that we need to come out of our own comfort zones in our homes and interact with people so that society can improve rather than digress.
That's a great response. It is a responsibility we have to participate in the society that we're a part of. That includes the religious aspects, I believe.
Yeah.
So, All right, so you are listening to Wealth Talks with the McPhees. You can call us at 702-660-7000. We help people to manage their finances to retain as much of the freedoms as possible in our current environment today, and to give you the tools and the education so you can expand on those freedoms for the next generation.
And the reason that we do this is we do believe that America is worth saving, because America is more than just a country. It's an ideology that is based on Scripture.
Yeah.
And we want to expound on that, and we want that baby to come to full maturity and be born so that the world will continue to look at America as the city, the light that's on a hill, the city on a hill that Jesus talked about and Ronald Reagan mentioned in his speeches many times. There's no place in the world like America, and we're proud to be Americans, and we want other people to have the freedoms, the liberty, and the ability to pursue their own personal property and find happiness, just like we have been blessed to do.
That's right. All right, so we'll be back here on Wealth Talks next week. Have a wonderful week.